The first value at the center of the Greenbelt movement's work is a demonstrable love for the environment. With these words, Kenyan environmental activist and Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai opens chapter 4 of her luminous book, Replenishing the Earth: Spiritual Values for Healing Ourselves and the World. In this chapter, titled The Power of the Tree, Maathai traces humanity's long history of revering trees and creating sacred forest groves. This, she posits, is a natural response to the understanding of how much life on the planet depends on trees and forests. However, quite often in African communities, this understanding and the need to protect trees and forests is operationalized through taboos and prohibitions which, essentially, use fear as a motivator. So in this week's episode, we'll look at fear and love, two prevailing dispositions Africans take towards the trees and forests of the continent. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Nde. One of my biggest regrets in life is that I spent 14 years in Buea, Cameroon, and never once climbed Mongo Mandemi, the mountain of greatness. You might know it as Mount Faku or Mount Cameroon, the massive and active volcano which looms over the town of Buea and much of Cameroon's southwest region like a benevolent god. There are many reasons why I never climbed the mountain. First, I was a child for most of those 14 years, and this would not have been an idle stroll. At 4,040 meters, or roughly 13,000 feet, Mount Faku is the highest point in West and Central Africa, the fourth highest peak on the continent, and the 31st in the world. Second, the law of the Bakwe people, on whose native land the Buea section of the mountain is found, depict the peak as a deity who is very protective of his forests which, by the way, are patrolled by not particularly friendly animals and spirits, so one did not just climb the mountain. Now sure, the annual Mount Cameroon race brought people from all over the world to scale the peak in like 3 hours or something ridiculous like that. But there was always some story about an athlete who ended up injured or dead because he or she didn't do something or another to appease the deity, or did something or another to anger the deity. And this doesn't exactly invite casual exploration, right? But the mountain was literally up the street from where we lived, so every now and then, while visiting friends, I would find myself in the spruce sections of the forest at its base. And the sharpest memory I have of one of such times is soured by just how apprehensive I felt at being in the forest, even though I could hear my friends talking and laughing and eating guavas nearby. And this is quite different from the serenity I feel these days when I am surrounded by nature. So what changed? My disposition is what has changed. I do not fear forests anymore. The African continent is the second largest in the world. It covers 11.6 million square miles, and that's about 30 million square kilometers for you who use the metric system. A fifth of this mass is covered by forests of different kinds. Africa's forests stretch from southeast to northwest and teem with plant life. There are about 8,000 documented plant species, and these represent only 10% of the plants in the African rainforest, which means, about 90% of the plants are just not known. Of this 8,000, more than 1,100 are found nowhere else on Earth, so they can only be found on the African continent. Forests are understandably integral to life for African people, but if you visited different communities across the continent, you will find traditionally two primary attitudes towards forests. For peoples like the Mbuti, the Twa, the Baka, and the Aka, Baka and Aka are separate by the way, the forest is an entity in its own right with which people can be in relationship and even communicate with. And every aspect of the lives of these people is entwined with the forest. They live in its depths, or at least traditionally they lived in its depths, and until recent times procured everything they needed to survive from what the forest had to offer. This is why they are collectively referred to as Africa's forest people, and they are one of the longest living inhabitants of the continent, one of the hunter-gatherer peoples. For example, the Baka, who are found in Cameroon's eastern region, believe that before there was anything, there was the forest. And so the forest is the primordial space out of which all life emerged. And the emergence of life in Baka mythology is the work of Komba, the loving creator who gave them the forests. Komba's representative is Jengi, the forest spirit, and Jengi permeates all aspects of life for the Baka people. Induction into the Jengi society means you get to access the secrets and the powers of the forest. And so traditionally it's required of all Baka people. And of course that's changing. So for the forest people, the primary attitude towards the forest is one of a deeply mutual and respectful affinity. One could even call it love. In my upcoming book, The Watkins Book of African Folklore, I retell and discuss the foundation legend of the Aka, also known sometimes as the Mbenjele. And these are another forest people who are related to, but not the same as the Baka. And in that account, Jengi plays a key role in bringing men and women together and forming the relationships and understandings around which the Aka or the Mbenjele communities organize themselves. Among most of the remaining peoples of the African continent, the primary attitude towards forests is one of a healthy, yet aversive respect, if not outright fear. In these communities, the forest is not a benevolent entity, but a landscape fraught with danger. And unlike forest peoples, settlements and farms are built in clearings after the necessary sacrifices have been made to appease the land and other spirits. Pioneering Yoruba writer Amos Tutuola's 1954 book, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, is a perfect example of this. The story follows the adventures of a young man forced to navigate a fearsome bush of ghosts filled with the most terrifying creatures drawn from Yoruba folklore. The bush, in many West African philosophical systems, is an otherworldly realm, a place of wild mystery and disorder. So belonging to a community of humans with rules and norms saves one from that disorder. And for most of these peoples, traditionally, the forest was the domain of hunters who alone, at least at the time, possessed the necessary knowledge to navigate it safely. This aspect is well treated in Forest of a Thousand Demons, a hunter saga, which is a novel by D.O. Fagunwa, another Yoruba writer who, like Amos Tutuola, draws inspiration from Yoruba folklore. Across the continent, historically, this aversion has been molded into intricate networks of restrictions and taboos, many of which ultimately work to protect both human and forest life. For example, almost all villages have sacred trees used as gathering spots or locations for sacrifices and other propitiatory acts, which you can't cut them. And most, if not all, peoples observed elaborate rituals before cutting down certain trees or even accessing certain parts of the forest. Certain parts of the forest were just taboo to visit. There's a Maasai folktale titled Enai Mine Enkiyo, the Forest of the Lost Child, in which during a time of famine and drought, a young girl called Nasira wanders into a forbidden forest looking for food and is never seen again. And there are many such stories. Ironically, in many cases, such taboos are responsible for some of the continent's most enduring pockets of forest biodiversity. I should emphasize that I'm not claiming that there was no love for appreciation of the forest among Africans who are not forest people. What I am saying is that the philosophies which underpinned each group's relationship to the forest tended to be very different. And this difference in orientation has caused conflict. For example, encounters between African forest peoples and other African peoples in the course of migrations like the Bantu expansions have created a rich body of folklore in which the forest people are usually cast as these magical beings who have deep knowledge of the natural world, and in some other cases are tricky and violent cannibals to be avoided at all costs or destroyed. And these stories most likely reflect the nature of the encounters between these two groups of people as the migrations spread. Migrating populations were, after all, encroaching on and building settlements in territories previously occupied by various hunter-gatherer and forest peoples. So these encounters could be friendly or hostile. But then the thing is, these stereotypes have persisted to the present day, and so what you have is that forest peoples across the continent are simultaneously admired for their close connection to the forest and the knowledge that this has yielded over time, but also systematically dehumanized and dispossessed of the same forests which have been their homes for millennia. Additionally, with globalization and urbanization, the attitudes which reinforce the reverence people have for forests are changing. Traditional beliefs are under pressure from Christianity and Islam and more materialist versions of modern science and global trade. So what this means is that the love which inspired connection or the fear which inspired caution are no longer really the driving forces behind many people's attitudes towards the forests and the natural world. More and more forest land is being appropriated for timber logging, for plantations, farms, human settlements, and other ventures, which is not necessarily a bad thing. As Wangari Maathai astutely remarks, whatever we feel for trees or forests doesn't necessarily imply that we shouldn't use natural resources. What we feel, though, does affect how we use these resources. For example, to the Baka, for whom the forest is everything, losing that connection is essentially a loss of personhood and identity, and is the reason perhaps why many forest people communities are now plagued by alcoholism and other addictions and violence as their forests are decimated for timber or appropriated as nature preserves to which they are not given access. On the other hand, as pointed out by Jonathan Onyekwelu, a Nigerian professor of silviculture and forest management, any sacred grove that loses its sacredness will lose its integrity in no distant time and may no longer be a sanctuary for biodiversity conservation. So what attitude might Africans want to adopt for the future? Love and connection, or fear and caution? A mix of both? A dispassionate scientific investment? I don't know, but personally, I vote for love and connection grounded in knowledge and gratitude. What do you think? As always, I'll include links to references and some past mythological Africans' Twitter or X posts about tree or forest folklore. I will also include a link to pre-order my book and an RSVP page for upcoming book talks in Atlanta and Dallas. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next week.